there. I know this is all different. I figured I would try and sit in a comfy spot while I talk about uncomfortable topics. Which by the title of this video, you could probably tell it was going to be like that. If you follow me anywhere on social media, you might have seen last week that I was celebrating anniversaries. Some very important anniversaries, but also anniversaries that are very painful. Whether or not it's the most comfortable thing for me to talk about, these sorts of stories are important. At the very least, it is very important in understanding who I am, what motivates me, and just a little bit of what I've been through. I paused for a sec so that I could run and grab my chip. So this year, on Saturday, October 3rd, I celebrated, I don't know if you can see this, 8 years sober. And I'm going to be honest with you, I have told my story so many times that I might come across very casual and talking about very difficult situations. At the same time, PTSD, man, like we don't know what's going to happen and what might choke me up. But rest assured, I am okay either way. So I figured I would talk to you guys kind of about my drinking career, but also how I got sober, my advice to anyone who's considering sobriety or recovery from addiction, and more or less how my brother's death ties into everything. So before I get into this, I want to put out a trigger warning. This is maybe self-evident, but I'll be talking about sensitive subjects like death, substance abuse, sexual assault, and probably a number of serious topics, but those are the big ones. So, walking back a little bit before my 8-year anniversary was the 4-year anniversary of my brother Robert's death. He died on September 30th, 2016. I actually find it difficult to talk about this date because I believe he probably died on the 29th, but he was found on the 30th, so that's the anniversary. I don't want to go into a lot of detail around my brother's death. For one, as you can tell by my shaky voice, I'm probably not ready for that, but also that's a whole other video that I don't even know if I ever want to make. But I will say that my brother's death was partially due to this disease of addiction, and it has largely to do with being sold a substance that we believe he did not intend to buy. So if any of you have lost somebody in a way that is sudden, tragic, especially when that person is young, you understand the nature of this kind of PTSD. Or CPTSD. It is very complicated. Even 4 years later, there are moments where flashbacks will hit me like a freight train, and it'll be like the simplest thing that triggered it. Something reminded me of my brother, or something he used to say. Suffice it to say, I miss my brother, and there's no end date on grief. So if you are grieving the loss of somebody, don't let anyone make you feel pressured into getting over it. That's a whole topic as well. Obviously, his death ties into this topic because apparently the disease of addiction runs in my family. And it took my brother, and I am 8 years recovered from it. But also, it's the stretch of time between those two dates, September 30th and October 3rd. September 30th of 2016 was the first time in my 8 years that I really wondered if I was going to make it the next few days to my anniversary. I had 3 days until my 4-year anniversary. And when I got the news of my brother's passing, I wasn't sure. And what's interesting is that when I do lose someone, I try to find their legacy in their passing as it relates to me. So how can I let this person live through me for as long as I'm alive, if that makes sense. So as an example, my grandfather, who was dying and rapidly deteriorating from dementia and Parkinson's disease, as a veteran at only 62 years old, one of the things he would say often in his last few days is that everything's going to be all right. Everything's going to be all right. And I remember when he passed saying to myself, okay, well, if Grandpa in that situation could tell himself everything's going to be all right, there is no reason that I should let anxiety control my life. And his death happened September 11th of 2010. So that is a time frame we're going to be talking about. And there are other examples of losing other people. And in the first year of losing my brother, I kind of tried really hard to find what his legacy would be through me. And it wasn't really until this year that I really started to marry the anniversary of his death with my sobriety anniversary. It's become apparent to me that those 4 days for me are potentially the 4 most important days of the year. And making it from one to the next makes my sobriety anniversary that much more meaningful. So much more meaningful. And I'm going to touch on how and why, I think, a little bit later. I should note, I didn't say this at the beginning, but this is definitely going to be a 2-parter. Not only is this too complicated and long of a topic for me to condense into one video, but it is not a topic that is easy to stay on track in a beautiful, eloquent, and concise manner. That's just not going to be this video. It never really is my videos, but it's especially if I seem all over the place, I'm so sorry, but that's the nature of talking about these things, and especially talking about my most personal experiences with the public. The internet has taught me that people will use some of your most painful experiences against you. And I ask anybody who's watching this to please treat this video and these topics with respect. Say what you want on my other videos or about other people in my life, but when it comes to my sobriety and when it comes to my brother, I would just appreciate that much. This is a super quick reminder to like this video and subscribe to my channel if that's something you want to do. If that's not something you want to do, just don't. I'll shut up and start talking now. So to talk about kind of where it all started, I think this is also an important note in my brother's story as well. One of the questions that comes up when people learn that you struggle with addiction or you have struggled with addiction is, well, what was it like growing up? What kind of family did you come from? Was there trouble at home? For the most part, we had a decent childhood, military, young parents. They did not do everything right. No parent does, but my parents did their best. And in fact, one of the things that my parents did was they lived a very straight edge life in an attempt to deter us from substance abuse. They really tried to do their part. I never, growing up, saw my parents drink, smoke, do anything like that. And I know at times my parents will wonder if that was somehow detrimental versus helpful. And I truly believe that I am an alcoholic because either certain events in my life later on would kind of turn on a switch that can't be turned off, or that I was born with this. Addiction is still a very elusive disease. We don't know how much of the disease is hereditary, how much of it is environmental. And the more we get wrapped up in the details of where it all came from, the more you lose sight of really what's important, which is I am an alcoholic. I live with the disease of addiction in me, and it will be in me for the rest of my life. So, good childhood, came from a good home. I was the oldest of 4 siblings. and I was the goody two-shoes. It was really my job to go to school, get good grades, don't get in trouble, and help my parents look after my younger siblings. And damn it, I think I did a really good job at those things that I was meant to do as a kid. It wasn't until I grew up that things got difficult. So throughout high school, I never really drank. I think I probably had a total of like 3 Smirnoff Ices in my senior year of high school. But as I got older, I got more introduced to alcohol. So my first year of college, I went away at 17, moved from Georgia, which is where my dad was last stationed and where my family kind of settled. Moved to Boston, was at MIT, miserable for a year. I had my first boyfriend back home in Georgia, and probably thanks to the nature of the school I was at, partying just was not a common theme. You guys are probably getting a lot of jump cuts right now, and I'm really sorry for that. And as soon as I can, I'm going to try to find my comfort in telling this story and focus less on telling it perfectly or telling it in sequence, and rather just trying to find a way to tell you in a way that's natural for me. So, deep breath. Freshman year, MIT, went to a total of like 2 parties. I was introduced to liquor, but only drank on like 2 occasions. It wasn't until my sophomore year of college that I really started to get involved with alcohol. That just doesn't sound like a natural way of saying that, but it's when I really started to drink. I transferred to a school closer to home that is known for being a party school, but I really don't even think that was it. I think it had a lot to do with my second relationship that I entered at the time that I transferred schools. And without going into detail about my relationship with this person, we'll call him Gary. Gary was a drinker, and we were in somewhat of a long distance relationship where I was in my college town throughout the week for the most part, and then on the weekends I would visit him at where he went to school about 3 hours away. And it was really on the weekends that we would drink. There was nothing that seemed really all that out of the ordinary drinking for college students on the weekends. So that's what Gary and I would do whenever we visited each other, mostly on the weekends, whether it was just the 2 of us and a friend, us and a bunch of friends. There was always alcohol involved on the weekends. But thankfully, that stretch of time during the week without drinking allowed me, I think, to finish my schoolwork and actually get that degree. So thank you, long distance relationship. However, by the time I graduated, it was well known among my friends that Gary and I were drinkers, but to what extent, I don't think anybody really knew, except for him and me. Winter of 2007, I graduated, and Gary and I moved to Virginia to be closer to this area where there was a better job market. At that time, we were entering a recession, I believe. So jobs were hard to find. So we moved up here to live with my dad. I say up here, Virginia, not DC. But we lived with my dad, and it was early 2008 that I started my first big girl job. Awful. I hated it. I worked in government support contracting, and it was somehow the most boring and stressful job at the same time. Or I think maybe it was just a stressful time because of my drinking. So back up, Alicia. When Gary and I moved together, we obviously started living together. And it was pretty apparent right away that we would be heavily drinking every single night. That's all we knew to do together. We knew to do other things, but we've always heavily drank when we were around each other. We were so used to it. So we continued to do that every single night. And so that year, 2008, was Oddly, I think the worst year of my life. You guys may know or will know that some really difficult things happened in 2016, like I spoke of before. But 2008 really was the worst year of my life. It was the year that I drank the heaviest, I think. Sorry for the voiceover, but I don't think at any point in this video I really talk about the withdrawal aspect of my alcoholism, which really was one of the biggest and most important factors in terms of what perpetuated my drinking and does so for a lot of alcoholics. So when I talk about doing my heaviest drinking and hating work and all of that, it is largely because I wasn't even experiencing normal hangovers, which that in and of itself is an awful experience, right? But for me, it had gotten to the point where I was waking up at about 5 o'clock, say 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning almost every day, whereas I didn't need to be awake until like 7 or 8. And I would, because Gary had such a controlled way of drinking and made sure that the two of us did not start drinking until a certain time, I would essentially go the entire workday or whenever I woke up in the morning until the evening. So probably 5 o'clock in the morning until 8 o'clock at night in very intense withdrawal. In terms of what people saw in my day-to-day, they definitely smelled alcohol on me from the night before, and I was anxious all the time, which I tried my best to hide, more at panic level anxiety, and of course I had the shakes. I talked about this in a podcast recently, but my shakes would be so bad sometimes that by the time I did get home and go to take my first drink, I wasn't able to lift a shot glass to my mouth without making a mess. So I could not tell this story without talking to you guys about that aspect of my withdrawals. I may jump in later to talk more about the times that I've detoxed at home, which is not something I recommend, not something anybody in the medical field would recommend. But I will say that my withdrawals got a lot worse than even that. Where I was in a job that I hated. I got in trouble at that job for drinking. On the job, I was found passed out in the women's bathroom once, ended up waking up in the emergency room. I got a DUI driving home from work one afternoon. Another quick voiceover. It might be confusing when I say that Gary had us kind of on a controlled drinking schedule, and yet I'm talking about being drunk at work or being drunk on the way home from work. Essentially, there would be times that when he and I would be in some sort of argument, I would justify drinking during the day because I wanted to, and because he wasn't there to stop me. And I do think that is a very common theme among addicts and alcoholics. And in fact, to the point that I do believe it is common that the addict will often incite arguments in order to kind of feel justified in using or drinking because of some kind of manufactured anger. And I am so grateful that I did not make it far before I was pulled over. And that experience of going to jail and dealing with that is, I did tell myself I will never put myself in a position to experience this again. I'm not doing this again. Fun fact, I still don't have my license back. I moved to DC eventually, and so now finding a reason to try to make that happen just doesn't. Anyway, not the point of the story. I basically did this rinse and repeat cycle of hating work, drinking at night, sometimes drinking during the day, getting in trouble sometimes, on, off, and smelling like alcohol all the time for a year, just about. It was the end of that year when I left for medical reasons. I guess the whole idea was that I was supposed to take a leave of absence and somehow get better. And I don't think I knew what that was. I don't think my family knew what that was. And I don't think a lot of people know what that is. And so that is kind of why I want to tell my story, and I need to get to it. So I took that leave of absence. Things didn't really change all that much, and the team I worked for ended up disbanding during that time anyway. So I took that as a sign to maybe look elsewhere. And it was around that time that Gary and I decided to move away from the town where we lived with my dad and move much closer to DC, in what's called the metro accessible area, meaning that we can access DC's public transportation. So we moved to a city just outside of DC, and for most of 2009 and 2010, I was employed. We were at the tail end of a recession coupled with my drinking and really feeling completely worthless with how I left my last job, not feeling like anybody else will employ me. It was a number of reasons, but I was, for the most part, not working, save for like a 5 or 6 month period where I had a job that was awful. And there, I think the idea with us moving was that, hopefully we could start to build a better life for ourselves. And I will say that the nature of my drinking, our drinking, whatever you want to refer to, just did start to get a little bit better. Things weren't as bad as they were during that first year out of college. However, we were still drinking every night. There were a couple of occasions where I drank during the day. There was one occasion where I was passed out just on a lawn in my neighborhood. I really don't remember much about that. So understandably, my boyfriend at the time felt that he couldn't handle the daily stress of not knowing what was going on at home. If he was going to walk through the door and I would be okay, or if he would walk through the door and I would be passed out, or if I would just not be there. So 2009, 2010, I spent some time living with my boyfriend in the suburb of DC, but I also spent a lot of time living at my dad's house down in Virginia. And sometimes I would just kind of travel back and forth for the weekends. And it was really living at my dad's house that things kind of started to change. Like I said, this was around the time that my grandfather was dying and did die. But while I was living with my dad, my brother, and my sister during the week, I was getting up every day and cooking and cleaning, going to the gym, and nothing else. I was still drinking, not nearly as heavily as I was before, but I was sneaking room temperature beer into my closet every single night, coming home from the gym. So this was going on day in, day out, day in, day out, in a place that I didn't feel at home. I love my dad, I love my brother and sister, but I wanted to be home. I wanted to be with my boyfriend and Oliver and in the apartment that I made a home. And I was finding myself, I don't know if maybe this was possibly my first run-in with depression in adulthood, but as I mentioned, I would cook, I would clean, I'd go to the gym, and the rest of the time I felt like I was just staring at the wall. Sometimes I would just stare at the wall. And I remember November of 2010, at one point, just something switched in my brain. And I thought, I can't live like this anymore. I need to do something. I want my life back, or a life that I haven't even had yet. I want that. I want a life. I want my cat. I want to have a place in this world and to not feel like a liability or somebody's responsibility all the time. So Thanksgiving weekend, I applied to 54 jobs in one weekend. And the way I did it, I just looked at a metro map, the map of our subway system, looked at where every single Gold's Gym was in DC, and then applied to jobs at every business that I could find around these Gold's Gyms. So after 54 applications, I did hear back from 2 places. I interviewed with these 2 places and I got job offers from both places. So one was a teaching job, more or less, like being a preschool teacher for the Richie Riches of DC, or I could work a front desk job in an apartment building that was opening up. Now, my background, my educational background is, well, it's all over the place, but my bachelor's degree I got in early childhood education, so that teaching job would have made sense for me. But my gut told me to go with the front desk job that when I interviewed was told that there was a good chance that I would move into another role pretty quickly, a leasing role that came with marketing responsibilities. And this was just so exciting for me. I mean, I made a decision to turn my life around, and then things started to turn around. So for about 3 months, I didn't have a drink. I pulled my shit together. I got the job. I did great at the job. I was starting to make money. I was starting to feel self-sufficient. At this point, I have no understanding really of what alcoholism is. And that'll be a theme throughout. And I think this is a theme throughout the lives of many alcoholics. But I had a relapse about 3 months later, sought treatment with a psychiatrist, and work was understanding and allowed me to keep my job. I should go back and note that the reason I ended up relapsing is because things were going so well. So this is another theme that we'll see in my story and in a lot of people's stories. But there is the I'm feeling shitty relapse, and there's the I'm feeling great relapse. So at this time, like I said, having no understanding of what alcoholism is, I felt like I was doing well. I felt okay. I was ready to drink again. And obviously I was not, because I wasn't able to stop until I made a concerted effort to stop. That was about a week-long period or something like that. It wasn't long. So I would go on to work for this company for 5 years, and they would see a lot of ups and downs. Once I went back to work, I would not have another drink for a year and a half. It occurred to me that I might not be able to drink. I still didn't have an understanding, but I just didn't want to run the risk anymore. So I decided that I'm going to be done drinking. I wasn't going to AA or anything like that, but I just decided not to drink. I was starting to make decent money in this job, and they moved me into one of the most beautiful buildings in Washington, D.C., a National Historic Landmark. Because I worked for the company, I got a great deal on a beautiful apartment. Seriously, sometimes I think I want to go back to that job just for the apartment, but no. But yeah, things were happening for me. I was sober, depending on who you are. You know, some people wouldn't want to use that word. Some people would say I was dry. I was a dry drunk or sober, depending on your definition. I wasn't drinking. I was making my own money. I finally had a beautiful apartment that was mine. Gary and I, shortly after moving into that apartment, broke up amicably after 7 years. To make things easier on us, I ended up finding him an apartment in that same building that he could afford. And that kind of comes into play later. So, yep, it was just me on my own. Me and Oliver in my new apartment, and things went pretty great. I was very happy from what I can remember. And then about 8 months later, after moving into this building, I met another man. Let's call him Eric. Eric and I would have a relationship that I thought, for the most part, at least for the first 6 months or so, that I thought was a very healthy relationship, that we were very compatible, that we were both responsible adults, but also had a creative streak and listened to a certain kind of music and enjoyed certain activities. And I thought the relationship was going great until it wasn't. Things started to get rocky. And again, it's important to note, neither he nor I had really any idea of what alcoholism is and what the implications are, what it means, what my responsibilities were as the alcoholic, and what his responsibilities were as somebody living with and loving an alcoholic. We did not understand those things, and that is part of the reason that I would relapse in the summer of 2012. So like I said, things started to get a little bit rocky, and time out. I'm about to tell you this part of the story. I am not blaming my relapse on Eric. If I relapse, that is as a result of my own decision to drink. But there was a lot of pressure coming from Eric that made it easier to relapse. Again, like I said, he didn't understand anything about this disease and would say things like, "Are you sure you can't drink? You seem like you're okay. I wish I could see you drunk. I wish that we could drink together. I miss drunk sex," which that's a fun thing to hear when that's something you've never experienced with your partner. So you know he's talking about somebody else. So yay, boyfriend points, Eric. But he would say things like this, and then at one point said, "Well, here's something we could try." I, at the time, was taking Ambien for sleep. He taught me how to abuse Ambien. I'm not going to go into details, but it was kind of, we thought, a loophole to where we could experience the sensation of drinking without actually drinking. So we did that, and that quickly became, okay, you know what? Fine. Let's stop arguing over whether or not I'll just drink. And I finally caved one day and decided that we would have a Friday night full of fun and drinking. And I don't remember much of that night. All I know is that things with me got out of hand right away, and that I ended up in the emergency room the next day, I believe. But that just goes to show you how quickly this monster can take over. And that's kind of, I've said a switch a couple of times, but I've learned that alcoholism it's a monster that lives inside. And right now it's dormant. And after a year and a half of not drinking, I awoke the monster. And that would create the summer of 2012, which was just an awful spiral for me. So just like I was a mess my first day back drinking, summer of 2012 was a mess for me. And for Eric and anybody else really who was involved in our lives at the time. I ended up in the ER a couple of times because I was found somewhere or because somebody was worried about me. I went on a trip to Miami for a wedding with Eric and ended up making a fool of myself there, ending up in dangerous situations, fracturing my finger in the hinge of a door. That's fun. And back home, getting in trouble again at work. Of course, they knew what was going on. My boss, we'll call him Josh. Josh was aware of my problem. He was aware of the first time I got in trouble back in early 2011. And so he understood that I was definitely in a relapse and I was getting in trouble at work. And I would end up in detox probably about 4 times that summer or so. And for anybody that doesn't know what detox is like, it's different depending on where you go, because I actually remember doing detoxing once when Gary and I lived in Virginia. That really just consisted of me laying in a hospital bed for a couple of days while I was hooked up to a bunch of IVs. But this form of detox meant that I would be admitted through the emergency room. So I would go into the emergency room where they would essentially, run some tests and start me sobering up. And then once stable, move me to the psych ward. And in the psych ward is where they would give me benzodiazepines, which are medications used to treat anxiety, seizures, and other illnesses. But they would treat me with these medications to help me detox off of alcohol, so that once I left after about 3 days, I was, hi, hi. I can't. He's too cute and I lose track of what I was saying. Yeah, usually detox meant that I would be in the psych ward for about 3 days. So that happened a few times. And while you're there, they take away your phone and your belongings. You can maybe wear your own clothes for the last day or two. Great. Hey, this guy. You make things so much easier, but really you make everything more difficult. Do you want to come sit? Atticus, we're not doing this. We're not sticking our ass up into the air for the camera. Go. No, we're not doing that. No, he just really wanted to stick his ass in the air and... No. I'll pet your face, but we're not doing... Okay. So, late that summer, after my relationship with Eric was officially over and work was giving me another chance and talking to my dad in the emergency room once again, I agreed to go to rehab. For what it's worth, if anybody wants to know how desperately and tragically alcoholic I was, the night before I went to rehab, I had a blood alcohol content of 0.49, which is well above lethal for most people. When I got a DUI, I blew a 0.34, which is insane. That is a very dangerous amount of alcohol for most people too. So I agreed to go to rehab, and here I will talk about, I guess, maybe kind of the benefits of rehab or what I liked about it. Granted, I did go to a very nice rehab. I think my dad thought that if he chose a nice rehab that I might be more willing to go. Really, honestly, what really was the kicker for me is that my dad in the emergency room was showing me the rehab's website on his laptop or on his iPad or something like that, and showed me, look, you can use social media there. They have Facebook and they have Twitter. And I thought, oh, okay, if I can get online and I can still communicate with my friends and stuff like that, like maybe it won't be so bad. Turns out you don't have access to social media in rehab. Who'd have thought? It must have been just their social media handles on their website. So cool, Dad. I don't know if you meant to do that or not, but either way, it got me there. Sorry to leave you hanging, but that is where we stop today. In a couple of days, I will return to tell you more about what my experience at rehab was like, as well as some truly horrific things that happened afterwards, and kind of how I got sober for good, and what my advice is to anybody who is struggling or just may want advice on this topic. So keep an eye out. I'll be back soon. Okay, bye.